Jet Moto 3 would be the third installment in the popular Jet Moto series that saw release on the PlayStation in 1999, but would only get an official release in North America. They tried to copy the same events and features from the original two titles, but would also change up many different aspects with the likes of the control systems and the visuals. The funny thing about it is that this game, it was a complete overhaul of the original. While some of the features did work, there were many elements that in many ways felt completely different. The control systems, while the ships that you were using felt a lot faster, there was better graphics in the environments, but just the control system didn't feel as fleshed out or as refined compared to the original games. It felt a lot more twitchy and harder to use. But even with that, the game actually got better responses with regards to reviews and its overall reception compared to the previous entries, as the game was developed by a completely different crowd compared to the previous two games and was published by 989 Studios. So even though it's a sequel, essentially it's a completely different game in many ways. And yes, it's playable and it is fun, but I just can't help but feel that a lot of it was taken away from the original titles. It just feels like a completely different game. And while the reviews scored fairly decently and above average in many cases, the game still has its own flaws that would become apparent, especially later on in the game, as the game would become overly difficult, especially with the twitchiness of the controls that can cause you to crash and just to lose your progress very, very quickly. Plus, it has the same gripes that was seen early on with some of the later tracks in Jet Moto 2, where you have some of the tracks that have very obscure jump sections or sequences that would be later seen in other prototypes that didn't get a release on the console. I have covered that in a previous video, I'll link it in the description. Even though the game was developed by a completely different studio, it still tried to carry on those very weird trends of some of the design ideas behind some of the tracks, and as a result, in many cases, while I suppose they were good for their time and were playable to some degree, but in many cases a lot of these inclusions often felt a little bit just weird and unfinished, as you could fall off the map at any point. If you went up too high in the air, it would just completely throw you off, and then it would respawn you at the latest checkpoint, and on some of the levels it would completely disorientate you because the checkpoint it would put you at, it'd be so far behind the pack that it would take you an eternity to catch up with them. So it left for a lot of frustration and even increased difficulty the further into the game that you got. But due to the lack of poor sales, there was two other sequels that were in development, but again they were cancelled. But because of the lack of sales, with regards to the overall reception of this game, the series pretty much was cancelled after that, never to be seen again. So it started and died on the PlayStation pretty much. In saying that, there was a sequel called Jet Moto Solar that was apparently supposed to be developed for the PlayStation 2, but it also got cancelled for whatever reason. It's just a very interesting series. Like, when we look at it, it had so many ideas where it took a lot of really cool concepts from popular games with Wipeout and other games like it. It allowed you to race on land and sea environments, but in many cases just lacked in particular areas, as a lot of these games, while they were good in many cases, they were heavily flawed in others, especially in my opinion the level designs, as it did have some nice graphics, but I just think the overall context, while the maps would show you where to go, but sometimes it would throw you off, as you never really knew where you were supposed to be, and there were certain elements with the collision detection that would cause you to completely go out of the map altogether and would throw you off. So it could force you to end up missing a checkpoint, which means you'd have to double back and go back again, which will only cause even more frustration. Like, I genuinely always try to see the best in games, and I always try to look for the positives, but sometimes there's games that are there, you can clearly see that there's too many flaws to make it worthwhile. But at the same time, aside from those flaws, the positives would be regarding around the unique level design, the visuals, even the multiplayer aspects, as the game was good fun to play with your mates in many respects, just like its previous entries. The game is definitely a lot faster compared to the previous two games as well, which also contributes to the higher difficulty levels, because you can't really just go flat out on the tracks, because you will crash into everything and you will go flying off the map very, very easily. There's a lot of trial and error involved to really get to grips with the environment layouts and the control systems. But I suppose it is what it is. It's just a reflection of its time. It had some really good ideas, but in many cases with certain features it just wasn't executed as well as it could have been. Even though this game was the third entry in the series, there was still certain flaws that hadn't been ironed out from the previous two games that could have been made a lot better in many regards, because if they were completely changing the overall aspects of the game, it would have been the perfect time to iron out some of those flaws, but that clearly wasn't the case. It's still an interesting game to look at regardless. The whole whole series in general, as it presented some very intricate ideas that, had they been executed a wee bit better, I think would have provided and probably become one of the better series on the PlayStation in terms of this genre. But unfortunately we'll never get an answer to that. But still, if you like futuristic racers, I would definitely recommend that you do check this series out, just to experience some of the interesting quirks that they had to offer. Like the first game, I have to say now, looking back, when I played it years ago, I thought it was a very fun title. Yes, it did have its flaws like everything else, but it was great for multiplayer gameplay. Plus it also had a very quirky soundtrack that really suited the aesthetic of the game. And the second game also had its own unique characteristics, but again, it was flawed. And this game here is no different really. While it does improve in some ways, it still doesn't really improve in other ways where it should have improved on. But still, it's an interesting series to look at, just to kind of see the ideas and the quirky nature behind the development of these type of intricate titles. But they still contributed to the overall look and feel and futuristic theme that the PlayStation was going for. So for those reasons alone, there's no harm in checking them out. But I would love to know your thoughts of Jet Moto 3 for the PlayStation, and what do you think of it overall? Did you enjoy this game as much as the previous entries in the series, or did you prefer the previous games, or vice versa? So be sure to share it down in the comments below. And if you would like to see more content around other types of futuristic racers that were also released on the PlayStation, you can check out the videos here on screen, and even other videos I've covered on the channel that look at those games so that you can see them in action. And as always, keep those gaming memories alive.